In the heart of the English countryside stands Winthorpe Manor, a grand estate that has sheltered the Duke's family for 7 generations. For over 2 centuries, an ornate mirror has hung in the main hall, its gilded frame a fixture as permanent as the stone walls themselves. No one questioned its presence until the day the Duke ordered it removed. What the servants discovered behind that mirror would shake the very foundations of the manor. A bricked-up alcove, sealed and hidden for generations, containing something that should have remained buried forever. Why would a family go to such lengths to conceal a space behind a mirror, and what could possibly justify such desperate measures? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Winthorpe Manor, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor of the grand entrance hall. The estate had stood in this corner of the English countryside since 1742, its Georgian architecture a testament to the enduring wealth and influence of the Winthorpe family. 7 generations of dukes had walked these corridors, their portraits lining the walls in silent witness to the passage of time. Mrs. Margaret Holloway had served the manor for 30 years, rising from a young chambermaid to the position of head housekeeper. She knew every corner of the estate, every creaking floorboard, every draught that whistled through the ancient windows on winter nights. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her black dress was pressed to perfection, as always. At 62, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime in service. Yet her eyes held a warmth that the younger staff found reassuring. She stood in the entrance hall that morning, as she did every morning, inspecting the night's cleaning work. The marble gleamed, the brass fixtures shone, and there, dominating the west wall, hung the mirror. It was an imposing piece, nearly 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, its frame an elaborate confection of gilded wood carved with intertwining vines and flowers. The glass itself was old, slightly warped with age, giving reflections a dreamlike quality that had unsettled more than one guest over the years. Mrs. Holloway paused before it, as she often did, studying her reflection. The mirror had been there when she first arrived as a girl of 32, and it had been there for generations before that. According to the estate records, it had been installed in 1823 by the 3rd Duke. She had never questioned its presence, though she had noticed over the years that previous dukes had given specific instructions about it. It was never to be moved, never to be cleaned by anyone but the head housekeeper, and never, under any circumstances, to be taken down. The sound of footsteps on the stairs drew her attention. His Grace Edward Winthorpe III, the current Duke, descended with his usual measured pace. At 71 he was a tall man, though age had begun to curve his shoulders slightly. His silver hair was neatly combed, his tweed jacket impeccable. But Mrs. Holloway noticed what others might have missed. The slight tremor in his hands, the shadows under his eyes, the way his gaze kept drifting to the mirror with an expression she could not quite place. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, offering a small curtsy. "Margaret?" He nodded, but his mind seemed elsewhere. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes fixed on the mirror. "How long has it hung there, do you suppose?" "The records say it was installed in 1823 by your great-great-great-grandfather, the 3rd Duke. 202 years." His voice was barely above a whisper. 202 years of watching, of waiting. Mrs. Holloway felt a chill run down her spine. "Your Grace, are you quite well? Should I send for Dr. Patterson?" He turned to her then, and she saw something in his eyes that frightened her. Determination mixed with a deep, abiding dread. "I am quite well, Margaret. In fact, I am more clear-headed than I have been in months. Tell me, have you ever wondered what lies behind that mirror? Behind it, Your Grace. There is only the wall, surely. Is there?" He stepped closer to the mirror, his reflection merging with the real man in the warped glass. "I have been reading the family papers, Margaret. private journals that my father kept locked away. My grandfather before him did the same. Each duke passes certain knowledge to his heir, knowledge that is not meant for others, and I have learned things, troubling things. Mrs. Holloway clasped her hands together, fighting the urge to fidget. In 30 years of service she had never heard His Grace speak like this. "What sort of things, Your Grace?" He was silent for a long moment, his hand reaching out to touch the gilded frame. "This mirror was not hung for decoration, Margaret. It serves a purpose. Or rather, it served a purpose, one that I am no longer certain should continue. I do not understand, Your Grace." "No, and perhaps that is for the best." He withdrew his hand and turned to face her fully. "I want it taken down. Today. This morning, in fact." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom. Holloway felt her breath catch in her throat. "Taken down, Your Grace." "But it has been there for over 2 centuries. The instructions from previous dukes were explicit. It is never to be moved." "I am aware of those instructions, Margaret. I gave them myself to you when I inherited the title." The Duke's jaw tightened. "But I am countermanding them now. The mirror must come down. Today. Your Grace, forgive me, but perhaps you should reconsider. If your father and grandfather before him felt so strongly about keeping it in place, surely there must be good reason." "Oh, there is reason, Margaret. Excellent reason, in fact. But I have come to believe that some secrets do more harm kept than revealed." He looked at her with something approaching desperation. "I know this seems sudden. I know it violates tradition. But I am asking you to trust me in this. The mirror comes down." Mrs. Holloway had served the Winthrop family long enough to know when His Grace's mind was made up. She nodded slowly. "Very well, Your Grace. I shall arrange for the footman to assist. It will take at least 4 men given the size and weight. Use as many as you need. And Margaret, I want you present when it is done. You have served this family faithfully for 3 decades. You deserve to know the truth of what you have been protecting, even if you did not know you were protecting it." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed from the corridor leading to the library. A younger man appeared, perhaps 45, with wire-rimmed spectacles and an armful of leather-bound volumes. Dr. James Ashford was a historian of some renown, specializing in aristocratic family histories. The Duke had invited him to the manor 6 weeks ago to catalogue and organize the extensive Winthrop library, a task that would take months, perhaps years. "Good morning, Your Grace." "Mrs. Holloway." Dr. Ashford's cheerful voice seemed out of place in the tense atmosphere. "I have made excellent progress with the 17th century volumes. The collection is truly remarkable. I found a first edition of—" He stopped, noticing the Duke's expression. "Forgive me, is this a bad time?" "Not at all, James. In fact, your timing is fortuitous." The Duke gestured toward the mirror. "I am having this removed this morning. Given your expertise in historical investigation, I wonder if you might lend your observational skills to what may be discovered." Dr. Ashford's eyebrows rose. "Discovered? Behind the mirror, you mean?" "Precisely. Your Grace, forgive my confusion, but is there reason to believe there is anything behind it other than the wall?" "There is every reason to believe it, James." The Duke's voice was heavy with weariness. "Every reason indeed." Within the hour, Mrs. Holloway had assembled the necessary staff. Thomas, the young footman, stood ready with 2 of the groundsmen. Old William, the head gardener who had worked the estate for 40 years, had volunteered to help as well, his curiosity clearly piqued by the unusual request. Mrs. the cook had abandoned her kitchen to watch, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. The Duke stood to one side, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Dr. Ashford had produced a notebook and pencil, ready to document whatever they might find. Miss Holloway supervised the operation with her usual efficiency, though her heart beat faster than it had in years. "Carefully now," she instructed as the men positioned themselves around the massive mirror. "Thomas, you and Peter take the left side. William, you and James take the right. On my count, 1, 2, 3, lift." The men strained against the weight. The mirror was even heavier than it looked. The gilded frame solid wood, the glass thick and old. Slowly, with much grunting and careful maneuvering, they lifted it away from the wall. The hooks that had held it for over 2 centuries groaned as they released their burden. "Steady," Mrs. Holloway called. "Bring it forward, gently." As the mirror moved away from the wall, Mrs. Holloway stepped closer to examine what lay behind. For a moment she thought there would be nothing, just the expected wall, perhaps marked by the outline where the mirror had protected the paint from fading. But she was wrong. As the mirror cleared the wall completely, and the men carried it carefully to one side, Mrs. Holloway found herself staring at something she had never expected to see. The wall behind the mirror was not wall at all. Or rather it was, but it had been altered. Someone, long ago, had bricked up a section approximately 5 feet wide and 4 feet tall, creating what appeared to be a sealed alcove. The brickwork was old, very old. The mortar darkened with age, but it was clearly deliberate, carefully constructed, to fill in what must have once been an opening. The bricks themselves were of a style no longer used, confirming that this work had been done many decades, perhaps centuries ago. "Dear God," Dr. Ashford whispered. Stepping forward, he adjusted his spectacles, peering closely at the sealed alcove. "This is extraordinary. The brickwork dates from the early 19th century, I would say, consistent with the Georgian period." 1823, the Duke said quietly. "It was done in 1823. Everyone turned to look at him. Holloway felt a coldness spreading through her chest. "Your Grace, how can you possibly know that?" "Because it was done by my great-great-great-grandfather, the 3rd Duke, Edmund Winthrop, the same man who hung the mirror to conceal it." He moved closer, his hand reaching out but not quite touching the old bricks. "He wrote about it in his private journal, a journal that has been passed down from duke to duke, always kept secret, always locked away. I read it for the first time 3 months ago, after my father's papers were finally sorted." "And what did this journal say?" Dr. Ashford's voice was barely above a whisper, his academic curiosity clearly battling with something darker. The Duke was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a burden he had carried alone for too long. It spoke of guilt, of terrible guilt and desperate measures taken to contain the consequences of his actions. Edmund was a troubled man, haunted by something he had. He sealed this alcove and placed the mirror over it, with instructions that it should never be moved. And each duke who followed honored those instructions, even as they inherited the knowledge of what lay behind. Mrs. Davies crossed herself, her face pale. Thomas the footman shifted uncomfortably, his eyes wide. Old William simply stared, his weathered face unreadable. Mrs. Holloway found her voice. "Your Grace, if this has been kept secret for so long, for good reason as you say, then why reveal it now? Why risk whatever consequence your ancestors feared?" "Because I have spent 3 months reading that journal, Margaret. 3 months studying my ancestors' tortured words, and I have come to believe that some sins cannot be hidden forever. Some wrongs must be acknowledged, no matter how long ago they occurred, no matter how much shame they bring to the family name." He turned to face them all. "I am 71 years old. I have no heir, no son to pass this burden to. The Winthrop line ends with me, and I will not leave this world without setting right what Edmund did wrong, or at least attempting to." The group stood in silence, the weight of his words settling over them like a shroud. The morning sunlight still streamed through the windows, but the hall felt colder somehow, as if the removal of the mirror had let something in, or perhaps let something out. Dr. Ashford cleared his throat. "Your Grace, with your permission, I would very much like to examine this alcove more closely, document it properly, and perhaps, if you intend to open it, to be present when you do." "I do intend to open it, James. That is precisely why I asked you to be here." The Duke's gaze swept over the assembled staff. "I understand if any of you wish to leave, what we may discover could be disturbing. I will think no less of anyone who chooses not to witness it." No one moved. Mrs. Holloway straightened her shoulder. "Your Grace, I have served the Winthrop family for 30 years. I will not abandon you now, regardless of what lies behind those bricks." Thomas nodded. "Nor I, Your Grace." The others murmured their agreement. The Duke's expression softened with what might have been gratitude, or perhaps relief that he would not face this alone. "Very well then," the Duke said, "we shall proceed together. But first, I want you all to understand something. What we discover here today may change how you see this family, this manor, and perhaps even your own roles in it. The Winthrop name has carried weight in this county for nearly 300 years. We have been respected, even admired, but respect built on hidden shame is no respect at all." Ashford had pulled out a measuring tape and was documenting the dimensions of the sealed alcove, sketching it in his notebook. "The craftsmanship is quite good, actually. Whoever did this brickwork knew what they were doing. It was meant to last." He ran his fingers along the mortar lines, and it has lasted. Over 200 years without significant deterioration. Edmund hired a mason from London. The Duke explained, someone who did not know the family, who could be paid well and sent away with no questions asked. The local workers would have talked. He needed discretion. Miss Holloway moved closer, examining the bricks herself. There was something deeply unsettling about the alcove, beyond its mere existence. Perhaps it was knowing that it had been deliberately hidden, that generations of dukes had walked past this spot, knowing what lay beneath the mirror's surface. "Your Grace," the journal. "Does it say what is actually sealed inside?" The Duke's expression darkened. "It does, but I would prefer you see for yourself, rather than color your expectations with Edmund's tortured descriptions." He was not, by the end, entirely rational. His guilt consumed him, according to his later entries. He died at 53, far younger than most of our line, and his final years were marked by what we would now call severe depression and anxiety. Driven mad by his secret, old William muttered. It was the first time the gardener had spoken, and his voice carried the weight of his years. "I've worked these grounds for 40 years, Your Grace. I've heard the stories in the village, whispers about the Winthrop curse, about dukes who died young or lived troubled lives. I always thought it was just talk, the kind of superstitious nonsense that clings to old families. But now I wonder." The Duke nodded slowly. "There is no curse, William, at least not in the supernatural sense. But guilt can be its own curse, passed down through generations. Each duke inherited not just the title and the estate, but the knowledge of Edmund's sin, and each carried that weight in his own way." Thomas, who had been silent until now, spoke up. His voice trembled slightly. "Your Grace, begging your pardon, but what if there is something in there that should not be disturbed? What if your ancestors had good reason to seal it away and keep it sealed?" "A fair question, Thomas." The Duke met the young man's eyes, "and one I have asked myself many times over these past months. But I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Hiding the truth does not change it. It only ensures that the burden continues, generation after generation. I have no children. There is no one to pass this burden to. It ends with me one way or another, and I choose to end it by bringing the truth to light." Dr. Ashford had finished his measurements and was now examining the edges of the alcove. The seal appears intact. No signs of previous tampering or attempts to open it. If we are to proceed, we will need tools. A hammer and chisel should suffice to remove the mortar. Mrs. Holloway turned to Thomas. "Fetch the toolbox from the groundskeeper's shed. The large one with the masonry tools." "Yes, ma'am." Thomas hurried off, clearly glad to have a task that took him away from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere in the hall. While they waited, Mrs. Holloway found herself studying the Duke more closely. She had known him for 3 decades, had watched him inherit the title at 41 after his father's sudden death. He had always been a thoughtful man, somewhat reserved, but kind to the staff and responsible in his duties. But over the past few months, she had noticed the change in him. The sleepless nights, the long hours spent in his study, The way he would sometimes stand in this very hall, staring at the mirror with an expression she now understood, was dread mixed with determination. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "may I ask you something?" He turned to her, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. "Of course, Margaret. When did you first suspect that something was wrong? That the mirror was more than just a family heirloom?" The Duke was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I suppose I always knew, in some way. My father told me on his deathbed that there were family papers I needed to read, that there was knowledge I must carry as the Duke. But he died before he could explain fully. It took me months to find the journal, hidden in a false bottom of his desk. When I finally read it, I understood why he had seemed so troubled in his final years, why his father before him had been the same. And the journal told you everything, not everything." Edmund wrote in fragments, especially toward the end. His mind was deteriorating, but he wrote enough for me to understand what he had done, and why he felt compelled to hide it. The Duke's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together. "I have spent 3 months deciding what to do with that knowledge. Part of me wanted to simply burn the journal, to let the secret die with me, but that felt like cowardice, like allowing Edmund's sin to go forever unacknowledged." Thomas returned with the toolbox, slightly out of breath from his hurried errand. The metal box was heavy, filled with various implements the groundskeepers used for repairs around the estate. Dr. Ashford selected a hammer and a sturdy chisel, testing the weight of each in his hands. "I should do this," the Duke said, reaching for the tools. "With respect, Your Grace, I have more experience with this sort of delicate work." Dr. Ashford's voice was gentle but firm. "Allow me. I will be careful to preserve as much as possible for documentation purposes." The Duke nodded, stepping back. Mrs. Holloway found herself holding her breath as Dr. Ashford positioned the chisel against the mortar line at the top left corner of the sealed alcove. The first tap of the hammer seemed impossibly loud in the silent hall. The second tap dislodged a small chunk of aged mortar that fell to the floor with a soft patter. "The mortar is quite degraded," Dr. Ashford observed. "Time has done much of the work for us. This should not take long." He worked methodically, moving along the top edge, then down the sides. The mortar gave way in chunks and dust, centuries of chemical bonds breaking apart under the chisel's pressure. Mrs. Davies had produced a handkerchief and held it over her nose and mouth as the dust rose into the air. Old William coughed softly. After perhaps 20 minutes of careful work, Dr. Ashford had loosened the mortar around the entire perimeter. "The bricks should come out now," he said. Carefully, one at a time, he set down the hammer and chisel and reached for the first brick. It resisted for a moment, then slid free with a soft grinding sound. He handed it to Thomas, who set it carefully on the floor. The second brick came more easily, then the third. As the opening grew larger, a smell began to emanate from within. It was not the stench of decay that Mrs. Holloway had half expected, but rather a dry, musty odor. The smell of old air, sealed away for 2 centuries, finally meeting the world again. There was something else in that smell too, something she could not quite identify, something that made her skin prickle with unease. Dr. Ashford removed another brick, and then another. The opening was now large enough to see into, though the interior was dark. He pulled a small torch from his jacket pocket and clicked it on, directing the beam into the alcove. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply stared, his face illuminated by the reflected light from within. Mrs. Holloway watched his expression change from curiosity to shock to something approaching horror. "Dear God," he whispered, "Your Grace, you need to see this." The Duke stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. He took the torch from Dr. Ashford's trembling hand and directed the beam into the alcove. Mrs. Holloway saw his jaw tighten, saw the muscles in his neck tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "So it is true. All of it. Every word Edmund wrote was true." Mrs. Holloway could not help herself. despite every instinct telling her to maintain her distance, to preserve the professional boundary between servant and the family's darkest secrets. She stepped forward. "Your Grace, what is it? What is inside?" The Duke did not answer immediately. He seemed frozen, the torch beam steady on whatever lay within the alcove. Dr. Ashford had stepped back, removing his spectacles to clean them with shaking hands, a nervous habit Miss Holloway had observed in him before when confronted with something that challenged his scholarly composure. Finally, the Duke lowered the torch and turned to face them all. His face had aged 10 years in as many seconds. "Margaret, perhaps you should see for yourself. You have earned that right, I think. But I warn you, it is not pleasant." She moved forward, her heart beating rapidly in her chest. The Duke handed her the torch, and she directed its beam into the darkness of the alcove. For a moment, her mind struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. Then, piece by piece, the contents revealed themselves. There was an iron box, perhaps 18 inches long and 12 inches wide, its surface mottled with rust and age. It sat on what appeared to be a small wooden shelf built into the alcove, but it was not the box that had caused such distress. Around it, carved or perhaps scratched into the brick walls of the alcove itself, were symbols. Strange, angular markings that seemed to form patterns, though Mrs. Holloway could not begin to guess their meaning. They covered every visible surface of the interior walls, overlapping and interweaving in a way that suggested desperation or madness. And scattered on the shelf beside the box were other objects. Dried flowers, so old they had turned to brown dust in places. A small bundle of what might once have been herbs, tied with a faded ribbon. And something else, something that made Mrs. Holloway's breath catch. A lock of hair, dark brown, or perhaps black, tied with a piece of delicate lace that had yellowed with age. "What are those markings?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking slightly. He had moved closer despite his earlier fear, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that afflicted them all. "Protection symbols," the Duke said quietly. "Or binding symbols. I am not entirely certain." Edmund's journal mentioned consulting with someone he called only the woman from Dedham. She claimed knowledge of old practices, old ways of dealing with spirits and curses. He paid her a substantial sum to teach him how to seal this alcove properly. Mrs. Davies crossed herself again, murmuring a prayer under her breath. Old William's weathered face had gone pale. "Your Grace, you are speaking of witchcraft." "I am speaking of a desperate man's attempt to contain something he feared," the Duke corrected, though his tone was gentle. "Whether the symbols have any real power, or whether they were simply a comfort to Edmund's troubled mind, I cannot say, but he believed in them. That much is clear from his writings." Ashford had recovered some of his composure and was now photographing the alcove with a small camera he had produced from his bag. "This is extraordinary. These symbols, they appear to be a mixture of various traditions. Some look vaguely runic, others might be alchemical. The combination suggests someone with eclectic knowledge, or perhaps someone making things up as they went along." "May we remove the box?" Mrs. Holloway asked. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Surely that is what contains the true secret." The Duke hesitated. Edmund's journal was quite specific. He wrote that the box should never be opened, that doing so would release what he had worked so hard to contain. But he also wrote in metaphor and symbol, especially in his later entries. I do not know if he meant that literally or spiritually. "Your Grace, you have already gone this far," Mrs. Holloway said. "The seal is broken. The alcove is open. If there was any containment, surely it has already been breached." The Duke considered this, then nodded slowly. "You are right, of course. We have already crossed the threshold. There is no turning back now." He reached into the alcove carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he feared disturbing something fragile. His fingers closed around the iron box, and he lifted it gently from its resting place. The box was heavier than it looked, solid and substantial despite its age. As he brought it out into the light, they could all see the intricate scrollwork on its lid, the craftsmanship that spoke of value and importance. The Duke carried it to a side table near the windows, where the morning light fell brightest. The others gathered around as he set it down, the metal making a dull thud against the polished wood. Rust had sealed the latch, and for a moment it seemed the box might not open at all. "Allow me, Your Grace." Old William stepped forward, producing a small knife from his pocket. "I have opened many a rusted lock in my time." With practiced hands, he worked the blade into the mechanism, gently prying and scraping away the accumulated corrosion. After several minutes of careful work, there was a soft click. The latch gave way. The Duke's hand hovered over the lid. Mrs. Holloway could see the tremor in his fingers, the visible struggle between the need to know and the fear of knowing. Finally, he lifted the lid. The hinges protested with a soft squeal, and the contents were revealed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had miraculously preserved them from moisture and decay, were papers, letters, by the look of them, written in a feminine hand on expensive stationery that had yellowed with age. Beneath the letters lay a small journal, leather-bound and worn, its pages filled with dense writing, and nestled in one corner was a locket, tarnished silver on a broken chain. The Duke lifted the locket first, holding it up to the light. It was oval-shaped, perhaps an inch and a half in length, with delicate engraving on its surface. He tried to open it, but the clasp was stuck fast. Dr. Ashford produced a small tool from his bag and carefully worked at the mechanism until it clicked open. Inside was a miniature portrait, a young woman perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and delicate features. Her eyes seemed to stare out from the tiny painting with an intensity that transcended the limitations of the medium. She was beautiful, but there was something in her expression that spoke of sadness, or perhaps foreknowledge of tragedy. "Catherine," the Duke whispered. Her name was Catherine. Mrs. Holloway looked up sharply. "You know who she was?" Edmund mentioned her in his journal. Many times, in fact, she haunted his every word, especially in the later entries. The Duke's voice was thick with emotion. "Catherine Hartley, the daughter of one of our tenant farmers. She was 22 when she died in 1823. The same year the alcove was sealed," Dr. Ashford observed. He had begun examining the letters, carefully unfolding the first with gloved hands he had produced from his bag. "These appear to be love letters, written to someone named Edmund, signed simply with a C." The Duke nodded slowly. Edmund and Catherine were lovers. It was a forbidden relationship, of course. A duke and a tenant's daughter. It could never have been sanctioned. But Edmund loved her, or so he claimed in his journal. Loved her desperately. "What happened to her?" Mrs. Holloway asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be terrible. "She died, suddenly and under circumstances that were never fully explained." Edmund's journal speaks of an accident, a fall, but his words are vague, almost deliberately so, and his guilt suggests something far darker than a simple accident. The Duke picked up Edmund's journal from the box, its leather cover soft and degraded with age. He spent the rest of his life haunted by what happened. These letters, this locket, the lock of her hair, he kept them all, sealed them away with those symbols as if he could trap her memory, or perhaps trap something else entirely. Thomas had backed away from the table, his face pale. "Your Grace, with respect, this sounds like more than just guilt over a lost love. It sounds like he feared her, or feared what he had done to her." "Yes," the Duke agreed. "I believe he did, and I believe that fear was the real reason for the seal, for the mirror, for all the generations of secrecy that followed." Ashford had spread several of the letters across the table, handling each with the care of a man who understood the fragility of historical documents. "These are quite beautiful, actually. Listen to this passage. My dearest Edmund, The hours until we meet again stretch before me like an eternity. I count each moment, each breath, knowing that they bring me closer to you. The world may say we cannot be together, but the world does not know the depths of what we share. He looked up, his expression thoughtful. She loved him, truly and deeply. And he loved her, the Duke added quietly, or convinced himself he did. His journal is filled with professions of devotion. But there is something else woven through those professions. Possessiveness, jealousy, the sense that he viewed her as belonging to him, as though love gave him ownership. Mrs. Holloway felt a chill run through her. She had known men like that in her life, men who confused love with control. Your Grace, are you suggesting that Edmund harmed her deliberately? I am suggesting that the circumstances of her death were not what they appeared to be, and that Edmund knew far more than he ever revealed. The Duke opened Edmund's journal carefully, the pages crackling with age. He wrote this entry dated March 15, 1823. She threatened to leave me, to expose our relationship and face the consequences. Shame be damned. She said she would rather live in truth and poverty than continue as my secret. I could not allow it. The scandal would have destroyed everything. My position, my family's reputation, my very future. I tried to reason with her, but she would not listen. She would not see sense. What happened next was not my intention, and yet I cannot deny my role in it. God forgive me, but I cannot undo what is done. The silence that followed was profound. Even the usual sounds of the manor seemed to have stilled, as though the house itself was holding its breath. He killed her, Mrs. Davies whispered, her hand pressed to her mouth. Dear Lord in heaven, he murdered that poor girl. Or at least he believes he did, Dr. Ashford said carefully. His wording is ambiguous. What happened next was not my intention. That could mean many things. An accidental death during an argument, a push that led to a fatal fall, or perhaps something else entirely. Old William shook his head slowly. Accidental or not, a girl is dead, and he covered it up, sealed away her possessions and her memory like she never existed, and then spent the rest of his days afraid of what exactly? Her ghost? His own conscience? Perhaps both, the Duke said. He turned several pages in the journal, scanning the entries. His writing becomes increasingly disturbed as time goes on. He speaks of seeing her, hearing her voice in the halls, waking in the night to find her standing at the foot of his bed. Whether these were genuine supernatural occurrences or manifestations of his guilt-ridden mind, I cannot say, but he believed they were real enough to consult with that woman from Dedham. Mrs. Holloway pointed out, real enough to have this alcove sealed with protective symbols, real enough to place a mirror over it and command that it never be moved. Yes, the Duke closed the journal carefully. And now we have moved it. We have broken the seal, and whatever Edmund feared, whatever he worked so desperately to contain, we have potentially released. As if in response to his words, a door somewhere in the manor slammed shut. The sound echoed through the halls, loud and violent. Everyone jumped. Mrs. Holloway's heart raced as she looked around, half expecting to see something manifesting in the shadows. It is just a draft, Ashford said, though his voice lacked conviction. Old houses are full of drafts. But Mrs. Holloway had lived in Winthorpe Manor for 30 years. She knew its drafts, its creaks, its peculiar sounds, and she knew that no door in the manor slammed like that, without human hands to close it. She looked at the Duke and saw in his eyes that he knew it too. They had opened something that had been sealed for 200 years, and now, whether through supernatural agency or the power of suggestion, the manor itself seemed to be responding. The temperature in the hall had dropped noticeably. Mrs. Holloway could see her breath misting in the air, despite the spring sunshine streaming through the windows. The Duke moved to the windows, peering out at the grounds as though seeking reassurance from the solid, familiar world outside. The garden stretched toward the distant tree line, peaceful and undisturbed. Yet inside the manor, something had shifted. The very air felt heavier, charged with an energy that had not been there before. Perhaps we should take these items somewhere more secure, Ashford suggested, gathering the letters carefully. The library would be suitable, better lighting for examination, and we can secure the door if necessary. A wise suggestion. The Duke turned back to them. Margaret, would you ask Mrs. Davies to prepare tea? I suspect we will be at this for some time. And Thomas, please ensure all the windows on the ground floor are secured. I do not want any more unexpected drafts. Mrs. Davies nodded gratefully, clearly relieved to have a task that took her away from the hall and its oppressive atmosphere. Thomas followed her, though he cast several nervous glances back at the now empty alcove as he departed. Old William lingered, his eyes moving from the Duke to the sealed opening and back again. Your Grace, the old gardener said slowly, I have worked this estate for 40 years. My father worked it for 40 years before me, and his father before him. In all that time, the Winthorpe family has been good to us, fair and decent. But there have always been whispers, stories passed down about cold spots in certain rooms, about doors that open on their own, about sounds in the night that cannot be explained. I am aware of the stories, William, the Duke said quietly. Are you also aware that those stories all speak of a woman in a white dress, they say, who appears in the halls when the moon is dark? My grandmother claimed she saw her once, when she was a girl working in the kitchens, said the woman was beautiful, but sad, and that she was looking for something she had lost. William's weathered face was grave. We always thought it was just tales, the kind of ghost stories that grow around old houses. But now I wonder if there was more truth to them than we knew. Mrs. Holloway felt her skin prickle. She had heard similar stories over the years, dismissed them as the sort of folklore that attached itself to any estate of age and prominence. But now, with Catherine's portrait staring up from the locket on the table, those stories took on a different weight. Would grandmother never mentioned the name Catherine? Dr. Ashford asked, his scholarly instincts overcoming his unease. No, just that she was a woman in white, and that she seemed to be searching, always searching. William glanced toward the alcove. Perhaps she was searching for these, for some acknowledgement of what happened to her. The Duke picked up the locket again, studying Catherine's painted face. Edmund wrote that he buried her in the village churchyard, a simple grave marked only with her name and dates. No mention of their connection, no hint of what she had meant to him. He attended her funeral and never spoke of her again to anyone. At least, not to anyone living. We should visit the grave, Mrs. Holloway heard herself say. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise the others. If we are to understand what happened, we need to see where she was laid to rest. Perhaps there are records at the church that might shed light on the circumstances of her death. Dr. Rashford nodded enthusiastically. An excellent idea. Parish records from that period are often quite detailed. Cause of death, witnesses, all manner of information that might have been recorded officially, even if the family kept it quiet. Tomorrow, the Duke decided. Today we will examine these documents thoroughly, but tomorrow we will visit St. Mary's in the village. I should have thought of it sooner, but I confess I was focused solely on what my ancestor had hidden here in the manor. He looked at the box, the letters, the journal spread across the table. I wanted to understand his guilt, but perhaps I should have been seeking to understand her truth instead. They relocated to the library, a comfortable room lined floor to ceiling, with books accumulated over generations. Ashford had been working here for weeks, and his presence was evident in the neat stacks of catalogued volumes and the reference materials spread across the reading table. Now that table became their workspace for a different kind of investigation. The Duke carefully laid out Edmund's journal, opening it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, the script of a well-educated man of the early 19th century. The date at the top read January 18, 1820. He began this journal 3 years before Catherine's death, the Duke noted. The early entries are mundane: social obligations, estate matters, political observations, nothing remarkable. Dr. Ashford arranged the letters in chronological order, based on their dates, creating a timeline of the relationship. The first letter is dated June. Catherine writes of their initial meeting. She had come to the manor to deliver preserves her mother had made. Edmund encountered her in the kitchen gardens. He read aloud, "You spoke to me as though I were a person of consequence, not merely a farmer's daughter. You asked my thoughts on the roses, and when I told you I preferred wildflowers for their honest beauty, you laughed with such genuine delight. In that moment, I saw not the Duke of Winthorpe, but simply Edmund, a man who understood that true beauty needs no cultivation." Miss Holloway listened as the story unfolded through letters and journal entries. The courtship had been conducted in secret, meetings arranged in the woods, beyond the estate boundaries, or in the old gamekeeper's cottage that stood empty. Edmund wrote of his growing attachment with a passion that seemed genuine, at least at first. Catherine's letters revealed a young woman of intelligence and spirit, someone who loved Edmund but remained clear-eyed about the impossibility of their situation. As the months progressed, the tone of both sets of writings began to shift. Edmund's journal entries grew more possessive, more concerned with the practical problems their relationship presented. Catherine's letters, meanwhile, showed increasing strain. She wrote of the difficulty of maintaining the secret, of lying to her family, of the growing weight of knowing their love could never be acknowledged publicly. "Here," Dr. Ashford said, pointing to a letter dated January 1823. "This is significant." Catherine writes, "Edmund, I can no longer continue in this manner. You ask me to be content with stolen moments and hidden affection, but I am not made for such a life. I love you, but I love myself as well, and I will not sacrifice my honor and honesty for the sake of your reputation. I have decided to accept William Thornton's proposal of marriage. He is a good man, and he offers me an honest life, even if it is not a grand one. Please do not contact me again. Let us both seek happiness in the paths that are truly open to us." The Duke's face had gone pale. William Thornton, Edmund mentioned him in his journal. He was a young farmer from the neighboring estate, hard-working, respectable, everything Edmund was not, despite his title and wealth. He flipped through the journal to find the corresponding entry. Here, February 12th, 1823. "I cannot accept this. She is mine. She has always been mine. This Thornton fellow presumes to take what belongs to me. I will not allow it. I must speak with her. Make her see reason, the language of ownership," Mrs. Holloway observed quietly. "Not love, possession." Dr. Ashford nodded grimly. And here, February 10th, Catherine writes again, though clearly against her better judgment. "Edmund, I received your letter. What you propose is impossible. You cannot offer me marriage. Your family would never accept it, and society would destroy us both. I am resolved in my decision. Please, I beg you, let me go with grace. Let me remember our time together with fondness, not bitterness." But he did not let her go, the Duke said. He turned to the entry dated March 14th, 1823. He arranged to meet her one final time. "At the old gamekeeper's cottage," she agreed, he writes, only to make her position absolutely clear, to end things definitively. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and she never left that cottage alive. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Miss Holloway found herself staring at Catherine's portrait in the locket, imagining the young woman walking to that cottage, believing she was going to have a difficult but necessary conversation with a former lover, not knowing she would never return home. The entry for March 15, Ashford said softly, "May I read it in full, Your Grace?" The Duke nodded, his face drawn. "Please, We should know all of it. Dr. Ashford cleared his throat and began to read Edmund's words, written in a hand that had clearly been shaking. I did not mean for it to happen. I swear before God, I did not go to that cottage with murder in my heart. I wanted only to reason with her, to make her understand that she could not simply walk away from what we had built together. But she would not listen. She stood there, so calm, so resolved, and told me she had never truly believed we could have a future. That she had been foolish to let things go so far. That she hoped I would find happiness, but it could not be with her. The dismissal in her voice, the finality of it, something broke inside me. I grabbed her arm. She tried to pull away. We struggled. There were stairs leading to the upper room of the cottage. Old stairs, rotted through in places. She lost her footing. Or perhaps I pushed her. In that moment of rage and desperation, I cannot be certain. I only know she fell. The sound of her body striking the floor below will haunt me until my dying day. I climbed down to her. She was still breathing, but barely. Blood pooled beneath her head. Her eyes were open, staring at me with such confusion, such betrayal. She tried to speak, but no words came. I held her. As the life left her body, I whispered apologies she could not hear. And then she was gone, and I was left alone with what I had done. Mrs. Holloway pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back tears. She had seen death in her years, as anyone who lived long enough must. But there was something particularly terrible about this death, about a young woman whose only crime was wanting an honest life. He did not call for help, the Duke continued, his voice hollow. He did not report the accident, if accident it was. Instead, he wrapped her body in his cloak and carried her through the woods after nightfall. He buried her in a shallow grave near the river, intending to return later to move her to a more permanent location. But when he came back 3 days later with proper tools, her body was gone. Ashford looked up sharply. Gone? What do you mean, gone? Edmund wrote that the grave had been disturbed, not by animals, he insisted. The earth had been carefully moved, as though by human hands. Catherine's body had vanished. He never discovered what happened to it. He convinced himself that she had not truly been dead, that she had somehow survived and escaped. But he also knew that was impossible. He had felt her final breath against his cheek. No, he concluded, something else had taken her body, something that wanted him to know he could never truly bury what he had done. Surely there is a rational explanation, Dr. Ashford said, though his voice lacked conviction. Grave robbers were not uncommon in that era. Medical schools paid well for bodies. Perhaps, the Duke allowed, but Edmund did not believe that. And what happened next convinced him he was dealing with something beyond the rational world. He began to see her, not just in dreams, but in waking hours. She would appear in doorways, watching him. He would hear her voice calling his name in empty rooms. Objects would move. Doors would slam. The servants began to whisper about strange occurrences in the manor. His wife, whom he had married 3 months after Catherine's disappearance, grew frightened of her own home. Mrs. Holloway remembered old William's words about the woman in white. So he consulted the woman from Dedham. Yes, a woman named Moira Blackwood. According to one entry, she came to the manor in secret and spent 3 days examining the house. She told Edmund that Catherine's spirit was trapped here, bound by the violence of her death and the injustice of having no proper burial. She said the spirit would not rest until it received acknowledgement and resolution. The Duke continued reading from Edmund's journal, his voice growing more strained with each passage. Moira Blackwood told me there were 2 choices. I could give Catherine proper acknowledgement, confess my crime publicly, and allow her to be mourned and remembered as she deserved. Or I could attempt to bind her spirit, to contain it so that she could no longer manifest in the physical world. The first option would mean my ruin, likely my execution for her murder. The second offered a chance at continued life and position, though at the cost of living with the knowledge of what I had done. He chose containment, Mrs. Holloway said, though it was not truly a question. He did. Moira taught him the symbols to carve into the alcove. She provided the herbs and specific instructions for their placement. She told him to gather items that had been precious to Catherine, things that held her essence, her connection to this world. The locket she had given him, the lock of hair he had kept, the letters she had written, all of these were to be sealed within the iron box, along with his own confession, written in his journal. The box would serve as an anchor, holding her spirit close to these physical remnants, while the symbols prevented her from manifesting beyond the sealed space. Ashford had been taking notes, his academic training asserting itself even in the face of such grim revelations. This Moira Blackwood, do we have any other information about her? Such practices were dangerous in that era. Witchcraft accusations could still result in persecution, even if the burning times had long passed. Edmund wrote very little about her beyond her instructions. He paid her £100, a substantial sum, and she left immediately after the sealing was complete. He never saw her again. The Duke closed the journal carefully, and then he placed the mirror over the alcove. The mirror itself had belonged to Catherine's family, taken from their cottage after her disappearance. Edmund claimed it as payment for outstanding debts, but in truth, it was another piece of her he wanted to possess. The reflection, Moira told him, would serve an additional purpose. Spirits are sometimes drawn to mirrors, trapped by their own reflection. The mirror would act as a final barrier, ensuring Catherine remained contained. The afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the library. Miss Holloway realized they had been reading for hours, lost in the tragic story that had unfolded through Edmund's tortured words and Catherine's innocent letters. She stood and moved to light the lamps, needing the practical task to ground herself. "What I do not understand," she said as she worked, "is why Edmund kept these documents at all. Why not burn them? Why preserve evidence of his crime?" "Guilt," the Duke said simply, "and perhaps a twisted form of love. He could not let Catherine go, even in death. These letters, his confession, they were all he had left of her. Destroying them would have been a final betrayal, and for all his sins, he could not bring himself to commit that one." Dr. Ashford gathered the letters carefully, arranging them back in their chronological order. "We have established what happened, or at least Edmund's version of events. The question now is, what to do with this knowledge? Your Grace, you spoke of setting things right. What did you mean by that?" "Precisely." The Duke stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening grounds. "I meant giving Catherine what she was denied. Recognition, a voice, the truth of what happened to her. Edmund spent the rest of his life trying to silence her, to keep her hidden and forgotten. Every duke after him continued that silence, maintaining the seal, perpetuating the lie. I am the last of the line. There will be no son to pass this burden to, and I will not die knowing that Catherine Hartley remains nothing more than an unnamed ghost story, a cautionary tale without a face or a name." "You wish to make her death public," Mrs. Holloway said. "I wish to acknowledge her, to place a proper marker on her grave, assuming we can locate it, to allow the truth to be known, even if it tarnishes the Winthorpe name. Better an honest shame than a false honor built on silent tragedy." A sound echoed through the manor, footsteps, light and quick, running down the corridor outside the library. Mrs. Holloway moved to the door and opened it, looking out into the hallway. It was empty. The sound had stopped as suddenly as it began, but in the silence that followed, she could have sworn she heard the rustle of a dress, the soft whisper of fabric against stone. That evening, Mrs. Holloway found herself unable to rest. The guest room where she had spent countless nights during busy seasons felt different somehow, the familiar shadows taking on new shapes in the darkness. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of the old house settling, wondering which creaks were merely wood expanding and contracting, and which might be something else entirely. She rose before dawn and made her way to the kitchen, seeking the comfort of routine. Mrs. Davies was already there, kneading bread dough with more force than necessary. The cook's face was drawn, her eyes shadowed with lack of sleep. "You heard it too then," Mrs. Davies said without preamble. "The footsteps. All through the night, up and down the halls, and the crying. Dear God, the crying." Mrs. Holloway felt her stomach tighten. Crying. Soft, like someone trying to muffle their sobs. "I heard it around 3 in the morning, coming from somewhere above my room. I checked on the maids, thinking perhaps one of them was unwell, but they were all sleeping soundly. When I came back down, my kitchen door was standing open, though I know I locked it before retiring." Mrs. Davies' hands stilled in the dough. "Margaret, what have we unleashed in this house?" "I do not know," Mrs. Holloway admitted, "but His Grace intends to find out. We are visiting the church today to examine the burial records. And what if we discover Catherine Hartley was never properly buried? What if her body was never found?" Mrs. Davies' voice dropped to a whisper. "What peace can we offer a spirit that has no grave to rest in?" It was a question Mrs. Holloway had been avoiding asking herself. She had no answer to offer, so instead she helped Mrs. Davies with the bread, letting the familiar work quiet her troubled thoughts. The Duke appeared in the breakfast room shortly after 7, looking as though he had slept no better than the rest of them. Dr. Ashford joined in soon after, and Mrs. Holloway noticed he had brought Edmund's journal with him, wrapped carefully in cloth. "I spent the night reading through the later entries," Dr. Ashford said, as he accepted a cup of tea. "Edmund's mental state deteriorated significantly in the months following the sealing. He writes of increasing paranoia, of feeling watched constantly. He became convinced that the containment was not complete, that Catherine had found ways to reach beyond the symbols. He consulted Moira Blackwood again, but she refused to return to the manor. In her final letter to him, she wrote that he had not truly bound Catherine at all. He had merely imprisoned her rage, and rage contained does dissipate. It grows stronger. The Duke set down his teacup with a hand that trembled slightly. "I did not find that letter among the papers yesterday. It was tucked into the back of the journal, nearly falling out from the binding. I found it when I was making notes." Dr. Ashford produced a yellowed piece of paper, folded small and sealed with wax, that had long since cracked. She wrote, "You sought to silence her without giving her justice. You sought to hide her without granting her peace. The symbols I taught you will hold for a time, perhaps for generations, but they were never meant to be permanent. They were meant to give you time to do what was right, to confess and to atone. Instead, you have chosen to live with your sin behind a pretty mirror. Know this, Edmund Winthorpe. When the binding fails, and fail it will, the rage you have contained will be terrible indeed. I pray for whoever breaks that seal, for they will face the full measure of Catherine's fury." Mrs. Holloway felt the blood drain from her face. "Then we have not simply released a sad spirit seeking acknowledgement. We have released something far more dangerous. Perhaps," the Duke said quietly. "Or perhaps Moira Blackwood was wrong. Perhaps 200 years has been enough time for rage to cool, even for a wronged spirit. We will not know until we learn more about what truly happened to Catherine." They set out for the village shortly after breakfast, taking the Duke's motor car down the winding drive. The morning was grey and overcast, with heavy clouds threatening rain. The countryside that usually seemed so peaceful now felt watchful, as though the very landscape was aware of the secrets being unearthed. St. Mary's Church stood at the centre of the village, a stone structure dating back to the Norman conquest. Its graveyard stretched behind and to either side, centuries of the village's dead resting beneath weathered headstones and simple wooden crosses. The vicar, Reverend Michaels, was a man in his 50s who had served the parish for nearly 20 years. He greeted them at the church door with curiosity evident in his expression. "Your Grace, this is an unexpected pleasure, and Mrs. Holloway, Dr. Ashford, how may I be of service?" The Duke exchanged glances with his companions before speaking. "Reverend, we are researching a family matter, a young woman named Catherine Hartley, who died in 1823. I understand she was buried here in the churchyard." Reverend Michael's eyebrows rose. "Catherine Hartley. Yes, I recall seeing that name in the parish records. A tragic case, if memory serves. Come, the record books are kept in the vestry." They followed him through the cool interior of the church, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The vestry was a small room lined with shelves, holding leather-bound volumes dating back hundreds of years. The vicar ran his finger along the spines until he found the volume marked 1820. "Let us see." He opened the book carefully, turning pages until he found the entry he sought. Yes, here. Catherine Hartley, aged 22 years, buried March 18. Cause of death listed as accidental fall. Father was Robert Hartley. Mother was Anne Hartley. There is a note here that the burial was paid for by the Winthorpe estate. "Does it say where she fell?" Dr. Ashford asked, leaning closer to examine the record. "No specific location noted. Just accidental fall. The entry was made by my predecessor, Reverend Thomas Webb." The vicar looked up at the Duke. "If I may ask, Your Grace, what is your interest in this particular death?" The Duke hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "Reverend, what I am about to tell you must be held in confidence for now. But I believe you deserve to know the truth of what occurred, as this church gave Catherine Hartley her final rites without knowing the full circumstances of her death." Over the next 20 minutes, the Duke related the discovery of the sealed alcove, the contents of the iron box, and Edmund's confession. Reverend Michaels listened with an expression that shifted from shock to sorrow to quiet outrage. "So she did not die by accident," the vicar said when the Duke had finished. "She was murdered, or at the very least, died as a result of your ancestors' violence. And this was concealed for 200 years. Yes, and I intend to make it right, insofar as that is possible after so long." The Duke's voice was steady, despite the weight of what he was confessing. "But first I need to know where she is buried. I would like to visit her grave." Reverend Michaels closed the record book slowly. "That may prove difficult, Your Grace. You see, Catherine Hartley's grave is not marked. According to these records, she was buried in the paupers section of the graveyard, despite the Winthorpe estate paying for the burial. There is a plot number, but no headstone was ever placed." Mrs. Holloway felt anger rise in her chest. Edmund could not even grant her that dignity, a marker with her name on it. Perhaps he feared it would draw attention, Dr. Ashford suggested. Questions about how the daughter of a tenant farmer came to be buried at estate expense. Or perhaps, the Duke said bitterly, he wanted her forgotten entirely, erased from memory as completely as possible. Reverend Michael stood and retrieved a map of the graveyard from a drawer. "The paupers section is here, in the northeast corner. Plot 47 would be approximately here." He pointed to a spot marked on the aged paper. "I warn you, that section has not been well maintained over the years. Many of the graves are overgrown and unmarked. They made their way through the graveyard, following the vicar's directions. The newer graves near the church were well tended, with fresh flowers and polished stones. But as they moved toward the northeast corner, the care diminished. The grass grew tall here, weeds tangled among forgotten plots. Some markers had fallen over, their inscriptions worn away by 2 centuries of weather. Others had vanished entirely, leaving only depressions in the earth to mark where bodies lay. "Plot 47 should be just here," Reverend Michael said, consulting his map. They stood in a patch of overgrown grass, beneath an ancient yew tree. Several unmarked graves lay in a rough row, their locations evident only by the slight settling of the earth. Dr. Ashford knelt, examining the ground carefully. "There is no way to know which of these is hers without excavation, and I doubt that would be permitted." "It would not," the vicar confirmed. Church law requires substantial justification for exhumation, and even if we obtained permission, there may be nothing left to identify after so long. Mrs. Holloway stood very still, looking at the forgotten patch of earth. Somewhere beneath this tangled grass lay Catherine Hartley, or what remained of her, a young woman who had loved and been loved, who had wanted nothing more than an honest life, buried without ceremony or remembrance in ground reserved for those who had no one to care for them. "This is where Edmund's guilt brought her," the Duke said quietly. "Not to a place of honor, not among her family, but here, hidden and forgotten, even in death." He turned to Reverend Michaels. "I would like to commission a proper memorial, a headstone with her name, her dates, and an acknowledgement of the truth of what happened to her." The vicar's expression was troubled. "Your Grace, I appreciate your desire to make amends for your ancestors' sin, but placing a memorial that accuses a previous duke of murder will create considerable controversy. The church elders would need to approve such a thing, and I suspect they would have questions. Then I will answer their questions, all of them." The Duke's jaw was set with determination. "Catherine Hartley deserves to be remembered. If that means bringing shame upon my family name, so be it. Some prices should have been paid long ago." A cold wind moved through the graveyard, stirring the long grass around the unmarked graves. Miss Holloway pulled her coat tighter, but the chill she felt had nothing to do with temperature. She had the unmistakable sensation of being watched, though she saw no one among the graves but their small group. "Your Grace," she said softly, "do you feel that?" The Duke nodded. "Yes, we are not alone here." Dr. Ashford had stood from his examination of the ground, his face pale. "There is something you should see. Here in the earth," he pointed to one of the unmarked graves, where the grass seemed to form an unusual pattern. When Miss Holloway looked more closely, she could see it. The grass had died in a perfect outline, roughly the shape and size of a human body. "That is not natural," Reverend Michaels whispered. "I tend this graveyard myself, and I have never seen grass die in such a way." "It is plot 47, Ashford said, checking the measurements against the vicar's map. "This is Catherine's grave." The Duke stepped forward, standing at the head of the outlined shape. For a long moment, he was silent, his head bowed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the quiet graveyard. "Catherine Hartley, if you can hear me, know this. I am Edward Winthorpe, great-great-great-grandson of the man who wronged you. I stand here to acknowledge what was done to you, to speak the truth that has been hidden for 200 years. You were murdered by Edmund Winthorpe, my ancestor. You were denied justice, denied proper burial, denied even the dignity of a marked grave. This wrong has been compounded by generations of silence, but I am breaking that silence now. You will be remembered, your name will be spoken, and the truth of what happened to you will be known." The wind stilled. The graveyard became utterly quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Holloway felt tears on her cheeks, though she could not say exactly why she was crying. Perhaps for Catherine, for all the years of being forgotten. Perhaps for the Duke, carrying the burden of his ancestors' sins. Perhaps simply for the tragedy of it all. Then, so softly that Mrs. Holloway thought she might have imagined it, she heard a voice, a woman's voice, young and clear, speaking a single word. Finally, she looked at the others and saw that they had heard it too. Dr. Ashford's eyes were wide behind his spectacles. Reverend Michaels had gone pale, his hand moving instinctively to the cross he wore around his neck. The Duke remained standing at the head of the grave, his expression one of profound relief. "She heard," he said simply. "After all these years, someone finally spoke the truth where she could hear it." They stood in silence for several more minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The sense of presence gradually faded, leaving behind only the normal sounds of a country churchyard, birds calling from the yew tree, the distant sound of the village going about its daily business, the wind moving through the grass. "I will speak with the church elders," Reverend Michaels said at last. "I will explain the situation and advocate for a proper memorial. Given what you have told me, I believe they will agree. This is a matter of justice, not just family sentiment." "Thank you, Reverend." The Duke extended his hand, and the vicar shook it firmly. "I am prepared to cover all expenses, of course, and I would like the memorial to be substantial, something that cannot be missed or forgotten." As they walked back through the graveyard toward the church, Mrs. Holloway found herself thinking about the voice she had heard. There had been no anger in it, no rage or accusation, just relief. As though Catherine had been waiting for anyone to finally speak the truth aloud, to acknowledge what had been done to her. "Your Grace," she said as they reached the church gate, "what will you do now you have acknowledged the truth here, at her grave, but will you make it public beyond the memorial stone?" The Duke paused, considering. "I have been thinking about that question, Margaret. Part of me wants to shout it from the rooftops, to ensure that everyone knows what Edmund did. But another part wonders if that serves Catherine or simply satisfies my own need for atonement." "What do you think she would want?" It was a question Mrs. Holloway had not expected, and she took her time formulating an answer. "I think," she said slowly, "that Catherine wanted an honest life. She broke with Edmund because she refused to live as a secret, as something hidden and shameful. Perhaps what she would want most is simply to be known, to have her name, her story, exist in the world without shadow or concealment. Then that is what we shall give her." The Duke looked back toward the northeast corner of the graveyard, though the unmarked grave was no longer visible from where they stood. "A memorial that tells her story honestly, and perhaps a small book, printed privately, containing her letters and the true account of what happened, not for scandal, but for history, so that she is not forgotten again." Dr. Ashford nodded approvingly. "I would be honored to help compile such a volume, Your Grace. The letters deserve to be preserved. They show a remarkable young woman, one whose voice deserves to be heard." They returned to the manor in the early afternoon. The building looked different to Mrs. Holloway now, less forbidding somehow. Perhaps it was simply the grey light of the overcast day. Or perhaps it was the sense that something had shifted, some burden had begun to lift. But as they entered through the main door, Thomas came hurrying toward them, his face flushed with agitation. "Your Grace, Mrs. Holloway, thank goodness you have returned. There has been an incident." "What sort of incident?" the Duke asked sharply. "The mirror, Your Grace, the one we removed from the hall. It was being stored in the East Wing storage room, carefully wrapped and secured. But when old William went to check on it an hour ago, he found the storage room door standing open. And the mirror, Your Grace, it has shattered, completely shattered, despite being wrapped in protective cloth. There is glass everywhere, but here is the strange part." Thomas swallowed hard. "The glass has arranged itself into a pattern on the floor. Letters, Your Grace. Words spelled out in broken glass." "What words?" Holloway asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Not finished," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The glass spells out, not finished. Whatever we released when we took down that mirror, it is not satisfied yet. It wants something more." They rushed to the East Wing storage room, following Thomas through the corridors. The door stood open, just as he had said, its lock undamaged, but somehow released. Inside, the protective cloth that had wrapped the mirror lay in a heap on the floor, and scattered across the stone was a sea of broken glass, glinting in the afternoon light that filtered through the high window. But it was the pattern that drew their attention. The shards had indeed arranged themselves into letters, crude but unmistakable. "Not finished." The words sprawled across nearly 6 feet of floor space, each letter formed by dozens of glass fragments positioned with impossible precision. "This is not possible," Dr. Ashford breathed. "Glass breaking would scatter randomly. There is no natural phenomenon that could create such deliberate arrangement." The Duke knelt carefully at the edge of the glass field, studying the letters. She is telling us something. We acknowledged her death, spoke the truth at her grave, but that was not enough. There is something else she needs from us. Mrs. Holloway felt a chill run through her. Your Grace, perhaps we should consider what we actually know about Catherine's death. Edmund wrote that he buried her body by the river, but when he returned 3 days later, it was gone. We found her grave at the church, but how did her body get there if Edmund did not move it? The Duke stood slowly, his expression troubled. I assumed someone had discovered her body and reported it, that it had been recovered and buried properly, despite Edmund's attempts to hide it. But the burial record listed her death as accidental fall, Dr. Ashford pointed out. If someone had found a secretly buried body by the river, there would have been an investigation. Questions asked. The circumstances would have been suspicious at the very least. Yet the record suggests a straightforward accident. Then how did she come to be buried in the churchyard? Miss Holloway asked. And who paid for the burial if Edmund was trying to keep everything secret? They stood in silence, considering the implications. Finally, the Duke spoke. There is only one way to find out. We need to return to the church archives and examine not just Catherine's burial record, but everything surrounding that date. Who reported her death? Who arranged the burial? What story was told to explain how she died? And we should examine the estate records as well, Dr. Ashford added. Financial records from 1823. If Edmund paid for the burial through the estate, there will be documentation, ledgers, payment records, correspondence with the church. The estate ledger from that year, Mrs. Holloway said suddenly. I remember seeing it years ago when I was helping organize the old account books. It is in the monument room, along with all the other historical records. I can retrieve it. The Duke nodded. Do so. James, you come with me back to the village. Reverend Michaels may allow us to examine more of the parish records, if we explain what we have discovered. Margaret, once you have the ledger, see if you can find any other documents from that period. Letters, notes, anything that might shed light on what actually happened. They dispersed to their tasks, leaving Thomas to carefully sweep up the glass, though he insisted on sketching the pattern first, some instinct telling him it might be important to preserve. Miss Holloway made her way to the muniment room, a windowless chamber in the oldest part of the manor, where family documents dating back centuries were stored in metal cabinets, designed to protect against fire and moisture. The ledger for 1823 was exactly where she remembered, a large leather-bound volume, with the year stamped in faded gilt on the spine. She carried it to a nearby table and opened it carefully, turning pages until she found the entries for March. Her eyes scanned the columns of neat handwriting, recording expenditures for everything from servants' wages to repairs to the stables. Then she found it. March 20, 1823. A payment of £15 to St. Mary's Church, Winthorpe Village. The notation read simply, burial expenses, Hartley, as agreed. As agreed. The phrase caught her attention. It suggested prior arrangement, negotiation. This had not been a hasty payment made in secret. It had been planned, discussed, agreed upon with someone at the church. But why would Edmund arrange an official church burial if he had tried to hide the body? She continued through the ledger, looking for any other relevant entries. 2 pages later, she found another payment dated March 17, 1823, 3 days before the burial payment. This one was for £25, paid to someone identified only as R.H., with the notation, for services rendered and continued discretion. R.H. Robert Hartley. Catherine's father. Mrs. Holloway sat back, her mind racing. Edmund had paid Catherine's father for services rendered and continued discretion. What services, what discretion? She turned more pages, searching for context, for any other clues. Then she found it, an entry from March 15, the day after Catherine's death, according Edmund's journal. a payment of £50 to Dr. Marcus Webb for consultation and certificate. Dr. Marcus Webb, the vicar who had made the burial record, was Reverend Thomas Webb. Could they be related? A father and son, perhaps? And what certificate had the doctor provided? She was still studying the ledger when the Duke and Dr. Ashford returned several hours later, just as dusk was settling over the manor. Their faces told her they had made discoveries of their own. "Margaret," the Duke said, his voice strained, "we need to speak privately. All of us. The library." I think. Once they were settled behind the library's closed doors, the Duke poured himself a generous measure of brandy before speaking. "Reverend Michaels allowed us access to additional records, not just the burial register, but the correspondence files from that period. His predecessor, Reverend Thomas Webb, kept meticulous records of all church business. And we found letters. Letters from Edmund to the Reverend, dated March 15th. Dr. Ashford had pulled out his notebook, flipping to the pages where he had transcribed the relevant passages. Edmund wrote to the vicar explaining that Catherine Hartley had suffered a fatal accident while visiting the manor. He claimed she had fallen down a flight of stairs in one of the unused wings. He stated that to avoid scandal and speculation, he wished to have the matter handled quietly. He offered to pay for a proper burial and to compensate her family for their loss, provided the death was recorded as a simple accident with no further investigation. "And the vicar agreed?" Mrs. Holloway asked, though she already knew the answer. The vicar's son was the doctor who examined the body and issued the death certificate, the Duke said heavily. "Dr. Marcus Webb. We found his medical report in the files as well. He confirmed death by accidental fall, noting injuries consistent with such an accident. The report was dated March 16, one day after Catherine actually died." Mrs. Holloway pushed the estate ledger across the table toward them. "Edmund paid the doctor £50 for that certificate, and he paid Catherine's father £25 for services rendered and continued discretion." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture far more complex than Edmund's guilt-stricken journal had suggested. Dr. Ashford leaned forward, his academic mind working through the implications. So Edmund did not try to hide the body at all, or rather, he did initially, but then he changed his plan. He retrieved Catherine's body from the river, brought it to the manor, and staged it as an accident. Then he brought in a corrupt doctor to certify the death, and a vicar willing to ask no questions. He bought their silence, Mrs. Holloway said. The doctor, the vicar, even Catherine's own father. He paid them all to support his version of events. "But why?" the Duke asked, pacing the library. "Why go to such elaborate lengths? If he wanted to hide his crime, leaving her body by the river might have been more effective. Wild animals, decomposition. By the time anyone found her, the true cause of death would have been nearly impossible to determine. Unless he did not want her to disappear," Dr. Ashford said slowly. "Unless he wanted her to have a proper burial, to be laid to rest in consecrated ground. Perhaps his guilt was genuine, even as he lied about how she died. He wanted to give her that much at least, even if he could not give her the truth." Mrs. Holloway shook her head. "Or perhaps it was simpler than that. If Catherine simply disappeared, questions would be asked, searches conducted. Her relationship with Edmund might have been discovered, investigated, but an accidental death, properly certified and quickly buried, would raise no suspicions. It was not mercy. It was self-preservation disguised as decency." The Duke stopped pacing and turned to face them both. "There is something else. Something that changes everything we thought we understood." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. This was tucked into the back of the church correspondence file. A letter from Robert Hartley to Reverend Webb, dated March 19, 1823. The day before Catherine's burial, Reverend Michaels said we could take it for examination. He unfolded it carefully and began to read. Reverend Webb, I write to you in the deepest anguish a father can know. You have asked me if I am certain I wish to proceed with the arrangement as the Duke has proposed. You have expressed concern about the truth of my daughter's death. I must tell you now what I could not speak aloud when we met. Catherine did not die at the manor. She died at the gamekeeper's cottage on our land. I found her body there on the morning of March 15. She had been dead for some hours, perhaps since the previous night. The Duke came to me that same morning, before I could report what I had found. He told me his version of events, of the accident at the manor. He offered his money and his assurances that Catherine would be properly buried and that her name would be protected from scandal. But I knew he was lying. I could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. My daughter did not die at the manor. She died at the cottage where she had gone to meet him, and I believe he killed her, whether by intent or by accident. I cannot say, but I am a poor man, Reverend, and I have other children to feed. The Duke's money will ease their lives, will give them opportunities they would never otherwise have. And so I have made a bargain with the devil himself. I will accept his story and his coin, and I will live the rest of my days knowing I sold the truth of my daughter's death for £25. May God forgive me, for I will never forgive myself. The silence that followed was crushing. Mrs. Holloway felt tears burning in her eyes. Catherine's own father had known the truth and chosen to hide it, not out of ignorance or innocence, but out of desperate poverty and concern for his surviving children. So Catherine's spirit is not just seeking acknowledgement of her death, Dr. Ashford said quietly. She is seeking acknowledgement of her father's betrayal as well. The man who should have sought justice for her instead took money to stay silent. And that is what not finished means, the Duke said, his voice hollow. We acknowledged Edmund's crime, we spoke the truth at her grave, but we did not acknowledge that she was betrayed, not just by her lover, but by her own father, by the church that should have protected her, by the doctor who falsified her death certificate, by everyone who had the power to demand justice and chose comfort and coin instead. Miss Holloway stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening grounds. She was utterly alone. Even in death, she had no one to stand for her, no one to demand the truth. They all conspired to bury her quietly and move on with their lives, enriched by Edmund's guilt money. Not everyone, a voice said from the doorway. They all turned to see old William standing there, his weathered face solemn. Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace, but Thomas told me what you were discussing, and I thought you should know. My great-grandfather was Robert Hartley's brother. Catherine was his niece. The family knew she had not died in an accident. They knew Robert had accepted money to stay quiet. It created a rift that never healed. Robert's brother tried to go to the magistrate, to demand an investigation, but he had no proof, just suspicion and family loyalty. The magistrate, who owed favors to the Winthorpe family, dismissed him as a troublemaker and threatened him with legal action if he continued to spread what he called vicious rumors. So someone did try, Mrs. Holloway whispered. Someone did stand for her. My great-grandfather died a broken man, knowing his niece's murder had been covered up and that there was nothing he could do about it. He made his children promise to remember Catherine, to pass down her story, even if they could not speak it openly. That is why the tales of the woman in white have persisted through the generations. It was our family's way of keeping her memory alive when no one else would. The Duke moved to the old gardener and gripped his shoulder. Thank you, William. Thank you for telling us this, and thank you to your family for keeping faith with Catherine when no one else did. That night, the manor was anything but quiet. Doors slammed throughout the building, though no drafts could be felt. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors. The temperature dropped so severely in certain rooms that frost formed on the windows despite the mild spring weather outside. Mrs. Holloway found herself unable to sleep, listening to the sounds of a house possessed by grief and rage, 200 years in the making. At 3 a.m, she gave up on rest entirely and made her way downstairs, wrapped in a thick shawl against the unnatural cold. She found the Duke already in the library, still fully dressed, surrounded by the documents they had gathered. His face was haggard, his eyes red from exhaustion or tears or both. "Your Grace, you should rest." "I cannot rest while she is in such torment," he replied. "Listen to the house, Margaret. She is telling us her pain, her anger at the betrayal, and I do not blame her. Every person who should have protected her instead protected themselves or protected Edmund. Even her own father chose his other children over justice for her." Mrs. Holloway sat down across from him. "What can we do? We have acknowledged the truth. We are commissioning a memorial. We are creating a record of what truly happened. What more can we offer her? I do not know." The Duke's voice broke slightly. "But we must find out, or I fear this manor will never know peace again. And more than that, I fear Catherine will remain trapped in her anger and pain, unable to find rest." Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway, also unable to sleep. His hair was disheveled, his shirt untucked, so unlike his usual meticulous appearance. "I have been thinking about Moira Blackwood's letter. She said Edmund had not truly bound Catherine, only imprisoned her rage. She said when the binding failed, the fury would be terrible. But she also said the symbols were meant to give Edmund time to do what was right, to confess and atone. But Edmund never did confess," Mrs. Holloway said. "He kept the secret until his death, and every duke after him did the same." "Exactly. So Catherine has been trapped for 2 centuries, not just by the symbols but by the continued silence. Each generation that kept the secret added another layer to her prison." Dr. Ashford moved to the table, spreading out his notes. "But we have broken that silence. We have spoken the truth. Perhaps what we need to do now is not just acknowledge what happened, but actively work to undo the harm, to expose every part of the conspiracy." The Duke looked up, something like hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. "You mean make public, not just Catherine's death, but the involvement of the church, the doctor, her father, all of it?" "Yes, the full truth. No matter how ugly or uncomfortable, Catherine was not just murdered, she was erased, betrayed by an entire community that chose convenience over justice. If we are truly to give her peace, we must expose that complete betrayal." Mrs. Holloway considered this carefully. "That will create enormous scandal, Your Grace. The church will be implicated, the medical profession. Your own family's reputation will be destroyed, and the Hartley family, William's family, will have to face the knowledge that their ancestor accepted blood money." "I know." The Duke stood and walked to the window, though the darkness outside revealed nothing. "But perhaps that is the price that should have been paid 200 years ago. Perhaps some scandals should come to light, no matter the cost." A door slammed somewhere above them, so violently that the chandelier swayed. The Duke did not flinch. Instead, he turned back to them, with determination hardening his features. "Tomorrow, we will gather everything we have discovered. Every document, every payment record, every letter. We will create a complete account of what happened and who was involved. And then we will decide how to make it public, in a way that honors Catherine and exposes the full scope of the injustice done to her." "The vicar should be informed," Mrs. Holloway said. "Reverend Michaels. He has been helpful, and he deserves to know what his church's role was in all of this." "Agreed. And William's family should know the full truth as well. They kept faith with Catherine when no one else would. They deserve to understand exactly what happened and why." The following morning, despite their lack of sleep, they set to work with renewed purpose. Dr. Ashford took on the task of organizing all the documents chronologically, creating a timeline that showed exactly who knew what and when. Mrs. Holloway worked with the estate records, finding every payment Edmund had made related to Catherine's death and burial. The Duke drafted letters to be sent to various parties once they were ready to make the truth public. By mid-morning, old William had arrived with 3 members of his family: his daughter Sarah, a woman in her 40s who taught at the village school; his nephew Peter, who worked as a solicitor in the county town; and his elderly sister Margaret, who at 85 was the family's keeper of stories and traditions. The Duke received them in the drawing room, where he had laid out copies of the key documents. He spoke for nearly an hour, explaining everything they had discovered. When he finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice tight with emotion. "So my ancestor, Catherine's uncle, was right. He tried to get justice for her, and they silenced him. And we have been telling her story all these years, not knowing the full truth of how deeply the betrayal ran. Your family never gave up on her," the Duke said gently, "even when no one would listen, even when it cost you socially and economically to keep speaking of her. You kept her memory alive. That matters more than you can know." Peter, the solicitor, had been examining the documents with a professional eye. "Your Grace, if you publish this information, there will be legal ramifications. The Church could potentially sue for defamation, though given the documentary evidence, they would likely lose. More concerning is the damage to your own position. Many in the county still hold the Winthorpe name in high regard. This will change that permanently." "I am aware," the Duke replied, "and I accept the consequences. Some things are more important than reputation." The elderly Margaret had been sitting quietly, her gnarled hands folded in her lap. Now she spoke, her voice thin but clear. "I remember my grandmother telling me about Catherine. She said Catherine was waiting for someone to speak true, not just to acknowledge her death, but to acknowledge all of it. Every lie, every betrayal, every person who chose silver over her soul. She said Catherine would not rest until the full accounting was made." Mrs. Holloway felt a shiver run through her. "Your grandmother knew Catherine's spirit was here. She knew. Many of the old families knew. We could feel her presence, especially on certain nights. The dark of the moon, the anniversary of her death. She was strongest then, searching the manor, weeping in the halls. My grandmother said she was looking for someone brave enough to tell the whole truth, not just the convenient parts." The Duke exchanged glances with Dr. Ashford and Mrs. Holloway. "Then that is what we must do. The whole truth, every uncomfortable detail, every person who failed her." They spent the rest of the day refining their account, with Peter the solicitor helping to ensure the language was precise and the evidence properly documented. Ashford crafted a narrative that was both scholarly and accessible, suitable for publication in the County Historical Journal and potentially wider circulation. Mrs. Holloway contributed details about the manor itself, about the generations of servants who had sensed something wrong, something hidden. As afternoon turned to evening, Reverend Michaels arrived at the manor, summoned by the Duke's urgent message. They laid out the complete story for him, including his predecessor's role in the cover-up. The vicar's face grew pale as he absorbed the implications. "The Church," he said finally, "has a duty to truth and justice, even when that truth reflects poorly on those who came before us. I will support your effort to make this public, Your Grace. And I will work with the Church elders to formally acknowledge our institution's role in this miscarriage of justice. It will be difficult, but it is necessary. Thank you, Reverend." The Duke's relief was evident. "Your support means a great deal." "There is something else," Reverend Michael said. "If we are to truly honor Catherine, we should do more than place a memorial stone. We should hold a service, a proper memorial service, 200 years late, where we speak her name and tell her story and ask for forgiveness for all that was done to her." Dr. Ashford nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, a public ceremony. We could invite the entire village, the surrounding county even. Let everyone hear what happened and why it matters that we remember." The idea took hold quickly. They decided the service would be held in 1 week's time, giving them enough days to prepare properly and to spread word throughout the county. The Duke insisted it be held at St. Mary's at Catherine's grave, so that she would be honored in the place where she had been buried in shame and silence. "We will need to prepare the gravesite," Mrs. Holloway said practically. "Clear the weeds, make it presentable, and the memorial stone should be in place by then, if possible." "I know a stonemason in the village," old William offered. "A good man, skilled at his craft. If I explain the situation, I believe he would work quickly to have it ready in time." "What should the inscription say?" Dr. Ashford asked. "This is perhaps the most important decision. The words will stand for centuries. They must tell the truth plainly but with dignity." They debated this for some time. Various versions were proposed and rejected. Too flowery, too harsh, too vague. Finally, it was Sarah, the school teacher, who suggested the wording that felt right. Catherine Ann Hartley, born 1801, died 1823, murdered by one who claimed to love her, betrayed by those who should have sought justice, remembered at last by those who honor truth. May she finally rest in peace. The room fell silent as they considered the words. Then, one by one, they nodded. It was honest without being sensational. It named the crime without naming the criminal. It acknowledged the betrayal without specifically identifying the betrayers. And most importantly, it centered Catherine herself, not the scandal around her. "Perfect," the Duke said. "William, take that to your stonemason friend. Spare no expense. It should be the finest stone in that churchyard." As the evening wore on, they finalized the plans. Invitations would be sent to prominent families in the county, to the local newspaper, to anyone who wished to attend. The Duke would speak, as would Reverend Michaels. Old William would represent the Hartley family. Dr. Ashford would present the historical account, and they would read some of Catherine's letters aloud, so that her own voice could be heard, her words no longer hidden in a sealed box. Miss Holloway found herself both anticipating and dreading the service. It would be cathartic, certainly, a public acknowledgement long overdue, but it would also be painful, especially for the Duke, who would have to stand before the community and confess his family's darkest secret. "Your Grace," she said, as the others were departing, "are you certain you wish to do this? Once the truth is public, there is no taking it back." "I am certain, Margaret." The Duke's voice was calm, almost peaceful. "I have carried this burden for 3 months now. Edmund carried it for 30 years. Each Duke after him carried some version of it. But I will not pass it on. I will end it here, even if that means ending the Winthorpe reputation along with it." That night, as Miss Holloway finally retired to her room, she noticed something that had not been there before. On her bedside table lay a single flower, a wild flower, the kind that grew in the meadows around the estate. It was fresh, as though just picked, with morning dew still clinging to its petals, but no one had been in her room. The door had been locked. She picked up the flower carefully, turning it in her fingers. Catherine had written in one of her letters that she preferred wild flowers for their honest beauty. Mrs. Holloway felt tears prick her eyes. It was a gift, or perhaps a thank you. A sign that Catherine was aware of what they were doing, that she approved. She placed the flower in a glass of water and set it back on the table. "We will do right by you," she whispered to the empty room. "I promise you 1 week more, and the whole world will know your name and your story." The manor was quiet that night. No slamming doors, no phantom footsteps, no unnatural cold. For the first time since they had removed the mirror, the house felt at peace, as though Catherine herself was holding her breath, waiting to see if they would keep their promise, waiting for the moment when she could finally, after 200 years of rage and sorrow, let go and find rest. Mrs. Holloway slept better than she had in days, the wildflower on her bedside table filling the room with a gentle, honest fragrance that seemed to hold all the hope of spring. The week passed in a flurry of preparation. The stonemason worked day and night to complete the memorial, and when it was finally set in place at Catherine's grave, even the most hardened observers felt moved by its simple dignity. The white marble stone rose 4 feet high, its inscription deeply carved and filled with black lead so the words would remain legible for centuries to come. News of the memorial service spread quickly through the county, aided by a carefully worded notice in the local newspaper. The Duke had decided against hiding the purpose of the gathering. The notice stated plainly that the service would honor Catherine Hartley and acknowledge the injustice of her death and burial. It invited all who valued truth and justice to attend. The response was overwhelming. Some wrote in support, praising the Duke's courage in confronting his family's past. Others expressed shock and disapproval, suggesting that some secrets were better left buried. The County Historical Society requested permission to send observers. 3 newspapers from London sent word they would be covering the event. The story had captured public imagination in a way none of them had anticipated. On the morning of the service, Mrs. Holloway rose before dawn. She dressed with particular care, choosing a dark grey dress that felt appropriate for the solemn occasion. As she fastened her brooch, she noticed the wildflower on her bedside table. It had not wilted, despite having been cut for a week. Its petals remained fresh, its color vibrant, another sign, she thought, that Catherine was present and aware. The Duke was already in the breakfast room when she arrived, though his plate sat untouched before him. He wore a formal black suit, his silver hair carefully combed, but his hands trembled as he lifted his teacup. "Your Grace, you must eat something," Mrs. Holloway said gently. "It will be a long day." "I do not think I could keep anything down, Margaret. My stomach is tied in knots." He set down the cup. "What if I falter? What if I cannot find the words when the moment comes?" "You will not falter. You have prepared thoroughly, and you will not be alone. We will all be there with you." Dr. Ashford joined them shortly after, and then old William with his family. By 9 o'clock, a small procession of motor cars set out from the manor toward the village. The morning was clear and bright, warm sunshine breaking through the morning mist. It seemed as though even the weather was cooperating, offering them a beautiful day for this long-delayed reckoning. As they approached St. Mary's, Mrs. Holloway was astonished by the number of people gathered. The churchyard was filled with what must have been 300 people or more, perhaps half the village, and many from surrounding areas. They stood in respectful groups, speaking in low voices, their faces reflecting curiosity, sympathy, and in some cases disapproval. Reverend Michaels greeted them at the church gate, resplendent in his formal vestments. "Your Grace, everyone is here. The mayor, members of the county council, representatives from several historical societies, and of course the newspaper reporters. Are you ready?" The Duke took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. "I am ready. Let us give Catherine the acknowledgement she has waited 200 years to receive." They processed through the crowd to the northeast corner of the graveyard, where Catherine's new memorial stood. The stone gleamed white in the morning sun, its inscription visible from many feet away. Someone, Mrs. Holloway noticed, had placed wildflowers at its base. Many wildflowers, dozens of them, arranged in a simple but heartfelt tribute. Reverend Michaels took his position at the head of the grave and raised his hands for silence. The crowd quieted immediately, hundreds of faces turning toward him with expectation. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "We gather here today to do something that should have been done 200 years ago. We gather to honor Catherine Ann Hartley, to speak her name with respect, and to acknowledge the terrible injustice done to her. This is not a comfortable gathering. What you will hear today will challenge your assumptions about respected institutions and honored families. But truth, even uncomfortable truth, is what we owe to those who have been denied it." He continued, offering a prayer that asked for courage to face hard truths and wisdom to learn from the past. Then he stepped aside, and the Duke moved forward to stand before the memorial stone. The crowd pressed closer, and Mrs. Holloway could see reporters scribbling in their notebooks, photographers positioning their cameras. The Duke's voice was steady when he spoke, though his hands gripped the paper containing his prepared remarks so tightly the pages trembled. "My name is Edward Winthorpe, and I stand before you as the last Duke of Winthorpe. I come here today to confess a sin that has stained my family for 7 generations. In 1823, my great-great-great-grandfather, Edmund Winthorpe, murdered Catherine Hartley. She was 22 years old. She was intelligent, kind, and by all accounts she possessed a spirit that would not be constrained by the limitations society placed on women of her class. Edmund claimed to love her, but when she chose to leave him for a man who could offer her an honest life, he killed her. Whether in rage or by accident during a violent confrontation, the result was the same. Catherine died at his hands. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several people gasped. The Duke paused, letting the words sink in, before continuing. But Edmund's crime was only the beginning of the injustice done to Catherine. He did not act alone in concealing his deed. He paid a doctor to falsify her death certificate. He paid a vicar to record her death as accidental and ask no questions. He paid Catherine's own father to stay silent about what he suspected. And then Edmund sealed her memory away behind brick and mirror, commanding each duke who followed to maintain that seal, to keep the secret, to let Catherine remain forgotten and unmourned. The Duke folded his prepared remarks and set them aside. What came next was from his heart, unscripted and raw. I am the 7th Duke to know this secret. For 3 months, I have carried the weight of it. I have read Edmund's tortured confession. I have seen the evidence of the conspiracy that buried Catherine twice, once in this ground and once in deliberate silence, and I decided that I would not pass this burden to another generation. I decided that Catherine deserved better than to remain a ghost story whispered in darkness. She deserved to have her name spoken in daylight, her story told in truth, her memory honored publicly. He turned to face the memorial stone, his voice breaking slightly. Catherine, I cannot undo what was done to you. I cannot restore your life or give you the justice that was denied, but I can give you this acknowledgement, recognition, the truth spoken where all can hear it. You were wronged by Edmund Winthorpe. You were betrayed by those who should have protected you. And for 200 years, you have been forgotten by all but those who loved you enough to keep faith. I stand here today as a representative of the family that wronged you, and I say to you and to all gathered here, I am sorry. The Winthorpe family is sorry, and we will ensure that you are never forgotten again. Tears streamed down several faces in the crowd. Miss Holloway felt her own eyes welling up. The Duke's voice had carried such genuine remorse, such depth of feeling, that even those who had come skeptically seemed moved. Old William stepped forward next, his weathered face dignified in its grief. I am William Hartley, great-great-grandnephew of Catherine Hartley. My family has kept her memory alive for 200 years, passing down her story from generation to generation, even when no one would believe us, even when we were called troublemakers and liars for speaking of her. Today we are vindicated. Today Catherine's truth is spoken in sunlight instead of shadows. My great-grandfather tried to get justice for his niece and was silenced by powerful men. But he made us promise never to forget her. We kept that promise, and now, at last the world knows we were right to do so. His voice strengthened as he continued. Catherine was more than a victim. She was a woman of courage who chose truth over comfort, honesty over security. She refused to live as a secret, and that refusal cost her everything. Let us honor not just her death, but her life, her choice, her bravery. Let us remember Catherine Hartley as she was, a woman who knew her own worth and would not compromise it, even for a duke. The crowd erupted in applause. It started with a few people and spread like wildfire until hundreds were clapping, some openly weeping as they did so. When the applause finally subsided, Dr. Ashford stepped forward with Catherine's letters carefully preserved in protective sleeves. He had selected 3 to read aloud, chosen to show Catherine's intelligence, her spirit, and most importantly, her own voice. These are Catherine's own words, he announced, written in her own hand. For 200 years, they have been locked away in darkness. Today, they are brought into light. This first letter was written in July 1821. Early in her relationship with Edmund, he began to read, his scholarly voice lending dignity to Catherine's words. My dearest Edmund, you asked me today what I dream of for my future. I told you I dream of a small cottage with a garden, children playing in the yard, a life of honest work and honest love. You laughed and said I aimed too low, that I should dream of ballrooms and jewels. But I think perhaps you misunderstand what wealth truly means. To me, wealth is waking beside someone who knows all of you and loves you still. Wealth is speaking truth without fear. Wealth is living in daylight, not shadows. These are the riches I seek, and no title or estate can purchase them. A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd. Several women nodded, recognizing in Catherine's words something timeless and true. Dr. Ashford continued with a second letter, this one from January 1823, shortly before her death. Edmund, I must be honest with you, even if honesty ends what we have shared. I cannot continue as we are. You ask me to be content with stolen hours and hidden affection, but I am not made for deception. Every lie I tell my family, every secret meeting, every moment I must pretend you mean nothing to me. It chips away at who I am. I am becoming someone I do not recognize, someone who lives in shadows. This is not the life I want. This is not the woman I wish to be. I have accepted William Thornton's proposal. He offers me less in material terms, but he offers me something far more precious, the chance to live honestly. Please understand, and please let me go with grace. The silence that followed was profound. Even the reporters had stopped writing, caught up in the tragedy of a woman asking only to live honestly and being killed for it. Dr. Ashford's voice was thick with emotion as he read the final excerpt. From Catherine's last letter to Edmund, I agreed to meet you one final time only because you said you wanted to wish me well. I hope you meant that sincerely. I hope you can find happiness, Edmund, even if it cannot be with me. You are not a bad man, but you are a man trapped by your position and your fears. I hope someday you find the courage to live truthfully, as I have chosen to do. Know that I will always remember our time together with a measure of fondness, even as I recognize it was built on foundations that could never hold. Be well and goodbye. Dr. Ashford looked up from the letters, his eyes bright with unshed tears. These were the last words Catherine wrote to Edmund. 24 hours later, she was dead. She went to that meeting hoping for a graceful farewell. Instead, she met her end at the hands of a man who claimed to love her, but could not bear to let her choose her own path. He carefully returned the letters to their protective sleeves. Catherine Hartley was silenced in death. But today, her voice is heard. May we all have the courage she possessed to live honestly even when dishonesty might be easier. Reverend Michael stepped forward again, his expression solemn. Let us pray for Catherine. Let us pray for those who wronged her, that they may find forgiveness in the mercy of God. And let us pray for ourselves, that we may learn from this tragedy and commit ourselves to truth and justice, even when they are difficult. He led the crowd in prayer, his words carrying across the quiet churchyard. As he spoke, Mrs. Holloway felt a change in the air. The temperature, which had been comfortably warm, suddenly grew cool. A wind picked up, gentle but persistent, moving through the gathered crowd, and with it came a scent, delicate and unmistakable, wildflowers. Mrs. Holloway looked around and saw others reacting to it as well, people lifting their faces to the breeze, their expressions shifting from confusion to wonder. The scent grew stronger, surrounding them, filling the churchyard with the honest beauty of wildflowers in bloom. Then, as Reverend Michaels concluded his prayer, something remarkable happened. The wildflowers that had been placed at the base of Catherine's memorial began to glow, not with any earthly light, but with a soft, gentle luminescence that seemed to come from within the petals themselves. The glow spread, moving through the flowers like a slow wave, and as it did, each flower seemed to multiply, doubling and tripling, until the entire base of the memorial was covered in a carpet of glowing wildflowers. The crowd stood in awed silence, watching the impossible flowers bloom and glow. Then, in the center of that luminous carpet, a shape began to form. It was translucent, like morning mist, but it held the unmistakable form of a young woman. She wore a simple white dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Her face was the face from the locket, but animated now with life and peace. Catherine's spirit stood before her memorial, gazing at the stone and the words carved upon it. She reached out one ethereal hand and traced the inscription with her finger. When she looked up at the gathered crowd, at the Duke standing with tears streaming down his face, at old William and his family, at Reverend Michaels and Dr. Ashford, and Mrs. Holloway, her expression was one of profound gratitude. She did not speak, but somehow they all heard her voice, felt her words in their hearts, rather than their ears. Thank you. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for speaking truth. I can rest now. The glow intensified for a moment, so bright that many shielded their eyes. Then it faded, taking Catherine's form with it. When the light cleared, the wildflowers remained, but they were ordinary flowers now, their supernatural luminescence gone. Yet their presence felt like a blessing, a final gift from a woman who had waited 2 centuries to be acknowledged. The service concluded with hymns sung in Catherine's honor. As the crowd began to disperse, dozens of people approached the memorial to lay their own flowers, to touch the stone, to pay their respects. The Duke stood receiving condolences and congratulations in equal measure, his face exhausted but at peace. In the weeks that followed, the story of Catherine Hartley spread far beyond the county. Newspapers across England carried accounts of the memorial service and the remarkable events that had occurred there. While skeptics dismissed the glowing flowers as mass hysteria or tricks of light, those who had been present knew what they had witnessed. Catherine had been there. She had heard the truth spoken, and she had found peace at last. The Duke commissioned a second memorial, placed in the manor's entrance hall where the mirror had once hung. It was a bronze plaque bearing Catherine's name and dates, with a single line beneath, "May truth always find voice, no matter how long silence has reigned." Mrs. Holloway remained at Winthorpe Manor for another 5 years, until the Duke's death at 76. She died peacefully in his sleep, his affairs in order, his conscience clear. In his will he left the manor to be converted into a museum dedicated to local history, with a permanent exhibition about Catherine Hartley and the importance of historical truth-telling. Old William tended the manor grounds until his own death, ensuring that wildflowers always grew in abundance around the estate. His family continued their custodianship of Catherine's story, no longer as keepers of a shameful secret, but as proud guardians of an important truth. Ashford published his account of the case in the Historical Journal, where it became one of the most read articles in the publication's history. He went on to write a full book about Catherine, using her letters and the documents they had uncovered. The book became required reading in several universities as an example of how personal stories illuminate larger historical truths. On dark moon nights, some say a young woman in white can still be seen walking the grounds of Winthorpe Manor, but she does not weep or search anymore. She simply walks, peaceful and free among the wildflowers that bloom in eternal profusion, and those who see her say she is smiling, her face turned toward the light, finally home in the truth that was denied her for so long. The memorial stone stands in the churchyard still, weathering slowly like all things, but its message remains clear. Catherine Ann Hartley is remembered, her name is spoken, her story is told, and in the end, that is all she ever wanted: to be known, to be acknowledged, to live on in honest memory rather than hidden shame. 200 years late, she received her due, and in receiving it, she taught everyone who heard her story that some truths are worth any cost, and that silence, however comfortable, is always too high a price to pay for peace.